Coordinator at Merri Valley. I'm a political science professor. Appreciate you attending today. This event was originally scheduled to take place for my international relations class that ultimately got canceled. So we're glad to have a few students here and any of those who are joining us online or watching the recording later on. I'm grateful to the library for hosting us, to Michelle, our interpreter, and to my panel members and friends, Merri Fefles-Dunkle. She teaches political science, history, sociology. And my friend Josh Fulton, who teaches only history, compared to Merri, who's teaching half the social science department.
And anthropology.
And anthropology. So a little bit of context into this event. Anybody who's paying attention to world events, not only today, but over the last several years, it's just a really awful time. We've seen large-scale violence increase dramatically over the years. We have active genocides. We have interstate wars. We have civil wars. And conflicts are complicated. There's always a lot of different factors that explain them: ethnic, tribal, religious, economic, colonial, racial divisions, competition over scarce resources, climate change. The list goes on and on. In all of these wars and situations are nuanced, and I don't want to minimize all the different factors. But another take is that there's some macro level explanations that might explain why the world is so volatile and why there's more conflicts, and perhaps why the United Nations or the United States, who might historically have been kind of this global policeman, have not intervened or have kind of allowed situations to get beyond crisis points. So we're kind of using this framework of the decline of the post-World War II order, and it's not to minimize the 80-year time period after World War II and try to say everything was perfect and this utopia where there was all world peace and everything was great, but that in the last numerous years, perhaps 15 years, 20 years, depending upon how you want to pinpoint the decline of this post-World War II era. Arguably, there's been more anarchy. There's been more violence. There's been more disagreements between even historical allies. And I just wanted to end my intro with a quote from Mitch McConnell, Senator of Kentucky, who recently stated that this is the most dangerous time period since World War II, since before World War II. And he goes on to say there's certain similarities right now to the 1930s. So what do we have today? North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, Iran's proxies. They're very different kinds of countries, but they have one thing in common, and they hate us. With that in mind, that lovely positive note to begin with, just wanted to ask the panel members, so before we talk about that kind of World War II, post-World War II system, and explain maybe what that is and how it's eroded and what the consequences are, what preceded that? What kind of, did we have a system? And if so, how would you describe the world before World War II, and what global forces shaped the situation?
Sure. I mean, I can certainly speak to some of that. And good morning. And thanks to those who are able to make it today. Yeah, as you were finishing your comments, I was thinking about that phrase you had said, sort of world police, and going, yeah, if if they, if the South Park folks had made Team America World, if it had all been made like 50 or 100 years before, who's going to, what nation's going to be the main actor, necessarily in that kind of a film? And of course, it's going to be the British, right? They're going to be, kind of the primary actor with that kind of thing. And so that idea of, are there international systems, that are existing prior to the post, World War II and the post-World War II era? Yeah, there's attempts at international systems. And so the question becomes then, how far do you want to take, necessarily that conversation? But if broadly we want to look at it from the time period of the start of the U.S., and sort of the late 1780s, the early 1790s, the early sort of 1800s, you do have leading superpowers in Europe that are, massive influential actors, both economically and militarily across the globe. And that's going to be the British and the French. And up until about 1815, the French with Napoleon and his sort of, many issues, his attempted takeover and failure, of course, of this, you get some semblance of a structure. And this comes after 1815 and something called the Congress of Vienna. And that structure, by and large, even though there are directly challenges to it, that structure by and large kind of governs much of what Europe is trying to do and what the Americans are acknowledging for about 100 years. And then what you end up with is this kind of collaborative series of alliances where the British are sort of a stopgap holding over everything. I mean, I do always love that fact and reality that one of the great commonalities that so many nations across the world have is an Independence Day from Great Britain. That's always a lovely sort of thought. But once those alliances are just ripped asunder, with the First World War, you're going to see the collapse of a number of imperial states that have been holding on for a very long time, and really a kind of interwar period, to your point about the 1930s, that is quite tumultuous. I don't know, did you have any thoughts, Professor?
So to kind of pick up where Professor Fulton left off, so today is September 11th, right, 2025, and it's hard to not think about what today was 24 years ago, that today marked a change in American foreign policy. And I think that for Josh and I, teaching American history, we tend to look at, if you're teaching American history 1, those first roughly couple hundred years are more just about American history only, right? Things that happen within the U.S. Once you get into the 20th century, we start focusing on things that were happening with the outside world, because that marks the period where the United States started becoming more of a global power. Professor Fulton mentioned World War I, World War II, and even like a little bit before that. So I put a picture up here about no foreign entanglements, and that's actually an exact quote that came from George Washington. He talks about how the U.S. should avoid foreign entanglements, and we kind of did for the most part, with the exception of a few things like the Monroe Doctrine, but for the most part, we avoided it. Yeah, and then we get into the 20th century, we get into, the United States coming into World War I, reluctantly, because a lot of Americans did not want to enter the war. I think I have, so I've got a couple things. The one on the right is from that time, the idea of America First rally, let's stay out of Europe's war, make America safe for democracy. We were kind of avoiding, most Americans, like today, right? You hear a lot of the same rhetoric where, people are having difficulty, prices may be too high, and they're saying, well, why are we sending any money to places overseas? Why aren't we spending that money on us here at home? And that was the same kind of rhetoric that you've heard multiple times throughout American history. So this is nothing new, right? We're not in any different time. So I wanted to kind of throw that out there, and then we come into the post-World War II era, and then everything changes, right? The U.S. is at the center of, I'm going to go ahead to one. This is a picture here of Russian troops and American troops at the end of World War II. And I'm sure that both gentlemen can jump in on this, and feel free to whenever you want. At the end of the war, it's these countries that were the victors, right? The ones like the U.S., the U.K., France, Russia, they were our friends, right? The Chinese, before they became communist, they were our friends. And so we are the powers that basically were setting up this post-World War II era. What was this going to look like? And at the center of every organization was the U.S. pretty much, because as Professor Fulton talked about, he already mentioned how the U.K. was sort of in that role. We took over that role from the U.K. When French used to be the language of diplomacy, now it's English, or our version of, English, Americanized, American, yeah. So, I mean, and then I could keep going, but do you want to jump in? With anything?
Sure, if that's all right.
Please.
To build a bit on what Professor Fefles-Dunkle is saying,
Just say Merri.
yeah, what Merri is saying is, I think there's a few elements that need to be considered here. Yes, across the arc of much of the 19th century, does the United States vis-a-vis Europe take on a posture of isolationism? Yes, it does. Does it take on a posture of isolationism, as you mentioned, with the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America? No, not at all, not any little bit. And so the presumption, this idea of that America has historically always been this isolationist nation, is, well, to whom? To what nation? What are we talking about sort of with that? The U.S. was, throughout the arc of the 1800s, incredibly interventionist when it came to Latin America, to South America, we have this idea of folks who literally are just going down whenever they feel like it, trying to take over countries sort of in those areas. I mean, if this idea is that the U.S. is entirely isolationist, Panama would like a word Colombia would like a word. Some of these countries would like a word. Mexico would like a word of, sort of that kind of thing of, there is a certain element sort of to that. And with the America Firster stuff, which I love the images that Merri is posting, but what I think is interesting is that question of why isolationism? And I think that's an interesting discussion and maybe a tangent that we can go down of what is making folks isolationist in the 1930s, right? What's driving the nature of that isolationism? And there was a great book that came out a couple of years ago called Hitler's American Friends, which is a fascinating read for those who are interested in kind of the nature of the isolationist movement that existed in the US during the 1930s and right on the precipice of World War II. And, the presence of deeply pro-German, deeply pro-Nazi German, German-American Bunds, throughout the 1930s are a really interesting exploration that, okay, one can be isolationist because one doesn't believe in violence, one is maybe pacifistic, one, sort of has different views of government, or maybe one is isolationist in the 1930s because somebody's, pro-Nazi, and they'd rather have the U.S. not get involved. There is a certain element of that to be sort of concerned with. And this is something that maybe we can get into, but to your point, sort of, Merri, as well, about World War II, I think that for so many of us, having grown up in the aftermath of that war, that we cannot conceive of the nature of violence of what existed during that war. That for so many of us, World War II exists in video games. World War II exists in Netflix shows. It exists in programming. And that's okay because we aren't alive at that time. But it can also take us out of the very present reality of how truly awful that war was, which then necessitated on the part of the principal actors of that war of things are going to change. And they're going to change a number of ways. Yeah.
So to recap, pre-World War II, not good. Very, very bloody two world wars, competition. And if you lived in if you were born in 1900 in Europe, just as one example, because there's all parts of the globe that we could look at, you may have only thought that the countries within Europe were going to fight each other forever.
Right.
And now, kind of just segueing a little bit into transitioning into what is that post-World War II structure that we refer to when we say that something is in decline. What was it that was created after World War II that may have had some benefits in terms of that we haven't had World War III, that there's been major increases in economic integration, economic trade, the standard of living for many people around the world has increased. So just a few points about what was created after World War II and what this kind of structure is.
Yeah. The Security Council, I've got NATO, and I've got the
So part of it is, yeah, these institutions that were showing up on the screen. So again, some of the leaders led by the United States created global institutions. We have, not in any particular order, but essentially the general agreements on trades and tariffs later became World Trade Organization. The International Monetary Fund, it's complicated, but the idea was that, you know, currency devaluations and rapid inflation can create the potential for unrest and war. So the idea was that if you had more stable currencies globally, then that would lead to more peaceful integration of these various states, countries around the world. So we have the trade, the world trade, well, ultimately became the World Trade, the IMF, the United Nations, which the idea, this has been long in the works, but the League of Nations kind of preceded this idea of like bringing some international structure, not a world government, but an entity that would bring various countries together to try to settle differences, have agreements, and I think it was the second UN Security General, I can't pronounce his last name, he had this quote where the purpose of the UN isn't to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell. And so that's kind of one of my favorite lines about how people would say, oh, we had the Cold War, we had the Vietnam War, there's all these civil wars that took place during the past 80 years. So I'm, again, not trying to say that everything was perfect, but avoiding World War III, and you could just statistically see that the level of violence has gone down significantly in the last 80 years compared to the 50 years before World War II.
Oh, and part of what I'm thinking about with that, you know, to your point about pre-World War II bad, I go, yeah, I mean, to the point in the 20s where they even created what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where they attempted to outlaw war as an international treaty arrangement, going, yeah, guys, this is real bad, we should probably stop. And of course, that didn't work, you know, spoilers, and you end up with, of course, World War II, where most of the mass violence that occurs happens in 1944 and 45. Yeah. So, you know, to the tune of tens of millions dead, and to the point of the many organizations that both, you know, Kevin and Merri are mentioning here, are arising out of this one sort of polar opposite sort of political positioning between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then eventually allies on either side, but then also the nature of the violent post-war realities that Europe is facing, that others are facing. I mean, the U.S. is in a very massive position of economic privilege in 1945, and would be so for a generation, but the, you know, extreme food insecurity, you know, the extreme, you know, homelessness crisis that was facing Europe, particularly in the summer and fall of 45, where you're looking at something like, you know, 80, I mean, it varies, but I've seen figures between like, what is it, 80 to 100 million people that are homeless and on the roads in Europe in 1945. That's a recipe for real conflict and problems. And so there's gotta be order and a way, not of global government, but a way to be able to provide for that, to prevent, as you say, future conflict.
Right. And the U.S. was instrumental in providing that order. I mean, it was through financial security. I loved Kevin's comment about if you were born in 1900, because you literally made me think of one of my closest friends is a doctor in Greece. Her grandmother, who has the same name, lived to be 111 years old, and she was born in 1900. And so she survived 2 world wars, the Balkan Wars also in the area, a Greek Civil War after World War II, and all those things that Josh was talking about, the idea of food insecurity, which most of us have no idea what that's like. Most of us don't know what it's like to ever go hungry. People right now, unfortunately, in Gaza know what that's like, but for us, we have no conception of that. So for someone like her to see all those years, these organizations that afterwards came in, like the United States spearheading programs like the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, that was basically, to a degree, kind of helping to rebuild Europe. And you could say throwing money at a problem, but to a degree it worked, because going back to the comment that I believe Kevin made, like, if you want to take the Star Wars idea that economic insecurity leads to political insecurity, leads to the dark side, right? All those things, one leads into the other. And so the U.S., okay, we can't kind of retreat back into our turtle shells. We've got to start, making sure that this continent that is ravaged by war, like every building in Germany was demolished. And as he said, people were traveling from place to place looking for somewhere to live. The U.S. kind of provided that beacon of light for decades and helped provide Europe on this path to this post-war prosperity that led to the European Union, to the breakdown of these different, like these trade barriers that had existed where, I'm not going to trade with this country. Well, now they broke them down to make trade flow more easier. But that also led to another series of problems, right? For every action, there's a reaction. And so one could really pretty much make that argument that the United States was instrumental in bringing peace to Europe. But now it seems like we're kind of in this era where all these securities that somebody like my friend's grandmother would have taken for granted are kind of on shaky ground right now, right? I think it's fair to say. I'll stop there because I don't want to. I could keep going, but I don't want to.
I know I left out a couple institutions, and we're kind of building this framework of the importance of the decline of this post-World War II structure, but we will get to, we're not going to talk about any one particular war or conflict in depth, but try to, for those of you who care or are very passionate about any one of these, to kind of understand about how this structure globally could be a major contributing factor to the dire situation that we might be facing in any one of these conflicts. So we also had, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a very significant development after World War II, and arguably very important even today. And we'll get to more recent events with Poland having drones being shot down, Russian drones shot down by NATO planes. But we have the European Union, which again, I think the integration of Europe and having a single currency for many of the states within Europe and have this kind of global structure and giving up of sovereignty. Somebody born in 1900 or maybe even 1930 would have never thought that this would have been possible. And then even just regionally in the United States, things like NAFTA, economic trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and a whole bunch of other examples like that of loosening protectionism, of allowing more free trade, this idea that when countries trade together, they'll be less likely to go to war with one another. And as states become more democratic, more democracies throughout the world, again, less likely to have violence between these states that are democratic. Basically having cooperation and security alliances, economic integration, that you're going to solve things with multilateral institutions. And we could pick a bunch of different examples. I know we didn't really have time to plan and talk amongst ourselves before this event, but I just, with what you both said, I was thinking of the first Gulf War, I think is what we might call it, but when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait, in this timeline, I think it was August of 1990.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, there's I'm not a historian, but a quick overview of this because it precedes your birth, for those of you who I'm looking at in the room. Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait. Kuwait, oil-rich country, but their sovereignty was also violated. And so this was violating the rules-based order that, no longer can you just have territorial aggression and just have a more dominant state go into a smaller state and just take over the land. And so the United States leads a global alliance of dozens and dozens of countries, including many Gulf area states. And UN Security Council. It's voted on domestically in the United States, and to give the authorization for use of military force. And very quickly, the United States and all of these allies are able to expel Iraq from Kuwait. And I think it signaled to the world and any world leaders, like, if you try to take over another sovereign state with military, like that conquest isn't going to be accepted in this post-World War II order, if you will. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
It's also not a coincidence that the president at the time was George H.W. Bush, who was the last president that we had who was a World War II veteran, and he believed very deeply in the idea that you work with your allies to do something. So this was a limited operation. This was not to go and overthrow the government of Iraq, but it was simply to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait. It was a limited operation. That was the goal of that operation, and it was successful. But it did lead to other things down the road. But it was all within that framework, though, of that post-war cooperation.
Of course, every time I think of I was 10 when the Gulf War happened, and so of course the thing that I think of was the Gulf War baseball cards that were handed out to 10-year-olds at that particular point in time, because the other part of that was kind of exorcising the Vietnam syndrome, right? Sort of this idea that, America had lost in Vietnam, and so they needed to kind of demonstrate global power, and then, the president at the time was able to kind of showcase that, certainly with those alliances, which is, we've said, we're set up in the aftermath of World War II, from NATO to what was at the time referred to as the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, right, CETO, and even the Rio Treaty, certainly with Latin America. But yeah, the power and importance and the necessity of alliances were certainly on display in the first Gulf War. Absolutely.
I think it's also fair to say, too, that that was also the time, and I'm glad that Kevin brought it up, that was when the Cold War ended. We didn't really talk about the Cold War at all, but this idea that the Soviets and the Americans were the two big powers that survived, if you will, World War II on their feet. And so the two of them were kind of fighting these, they called it a Cold War because it wasn't a hot war. We weren't really fighting one another directly, but we were fighting by proxy in different countries throughout the world for dominance, right? Like it was communism or whatever version that the Soviet Union was practicing, was that going to dominate, or was it going to be capitalism? And in 1981, we kind of felt like, oh, well, it looks like, capitalism won. We won. It's good. And the 90s was sort of this era where we were sort of kind of adrift with our foreign policy. Like we had some humanitarian crises like that of Rwanda, Somalia. But then you have the war on terror that comes after the attacks of September 11th. And then that gives us a whole other era of the U.S. leading this movement, but this time it's not as cohesive as the one that happened in Iraq in 1991. You're starting to see some cracks in that, and it was a NATO operation, right? Because it was the U.S. was the country that was attacked on 9/11.
We have 45 minutes left, so we have plenty of time, but I do think that this is a good segue. We can always go back, but I don't think any of us would be comfortable, and we may never know, like, when did this post-World War II era end? And the United States is kind of this global policeman, for lack of a better word or phrase, of the role the United States had. And again, there was Rwanda and all kinds of examples where there was genocide or ethnic cleansing, and it wasn't great. Maybe first starting with different dates or examples of how this system has eroded, because I honestly believe it's been years in the making, definitely preceding Trump, and we can get to kind of some of the ways that Trump and maybe MAGA and other global leaders don't view the same post-World War II structure as so positive, and one of the reasons why they may have wanted to disentangle themselves from that structure. But I think 9/11 is maybe a good starting point, and leading to essentially two. So 9/11 led to the United States going to Afghanistan. There was certainly some military successes early on, but even into your lifetime, even to just the Biden administration, we still had 2 decades basically of military operations, of troops being sent away from their families, of people being killed, of people who weren't even born in Afghanistan when 9/11 happened, who are now taking up arms against the United States because of their loved ones who have been killed, perhaps by errant bombing or mistaken identities, or just this idea that there's a foreign power in their own land. Iraq War 2003, not necessarily, well, it isn't related to 9/11, but in some ways there's this kind of momentum to be on the offensive, to not wait until the United States is attacked again, and being proactive of going against potential bad leaders like Saddam Hussein, who they argued had weapons of mass destruction, but they ultimately didn't. But the idea is that you wouldn't want to wait until they did have weapons of mass destruction where they could sell that to terrorists or use that against the United States. That too ended up ultimately being almost 2 decades of war for the United States. I think those are 2 good starting points of things that made the United States an exhausted superpower. And people like Obama, who came into office as being this kind of anti-war candidate, of somebody who's not going to intervene in places like Syria, even when Obama had a red line and said, once we see or if chemical weapons get used, and I think it was, I can't remember if it was August of 2013, where Assad uses chemical weapons and essentially the United States doesn't intervene. I think that's another key point. And I'm going on a tangent here, but those are 3 that come. The financial crisis, I'm going to list 4, of 2008, 2009, where a lot of Americans are losing their homes, or their jobs, and people are like, why are we sending so much money abroad in these failed or wars that are not maybe achieving their objectives, and we need to kind of retreat at home.
One of the things, as you were beginning your comments, was making me think about, sort of the juxtaposition between the Truman Doctrine and the Bush Doctrine, right? For much of the arc of the Cold War, so much of the 50 years or so, sort of post World War II, much of American foreign policy was based off of this idea, this Truman Doctrine, or this idea of, containment. Now this is going to be followed on with Eisenhower and other foreign policy statements, but this idea of most U.S. militarized involvement is going to be the idea of try to stop the spread of communism, right? Whatever you need to do. Whereas by the time you have the election of George W. Bush in 2000, and you have all the controversies there and everything else, that by the time President Bush takes office, and then within the arc of the year with 9/11 and everything, you see the development of a foreign policy posture for the United States that decidedly had shifted, and it became very principled in the idea of unilateralism or preemption, which is essentially the U.S. reserves the right to attack anybody, anywhere, whenever they feel like it, if they believe it's in the interests of national security. That's a little different than what had existed under the Truman Doctrine, and generated a lot of international consternation on the part of some, not just, of course, with the ongoing forever wars in Afghanistan and then eventually in Iraq, but in other forms of conflict as well. Certainly the continual, issues of drones in certain parts of the world, all that kind of stuff, and then aiding and abetting or supporting different allies that are going to support all of that. So I think that's certainly the development of that foreign policy doctrine, the application of that foreign policy doctrine, about 20, 22 years ago, certainly has had a lot of effects. Certainly the Obama presidency being one, but there's any number of effects with that as well.
I can't help but think when you say that, but the idea of preemptive war, going back even to the Six-Day War in the 1960s, when Israel uses it as a justification to go to war against its Arab neighbors, and then we use it again in 2003, and even more recently, President Trump talking about the idea that I don't know if you've been following the news, but that small boat that was coming from Venezuela, if any of you heard about that, that was, that basically, this was 3 days ago? When was this now? Over the weekend? Within last week.
I think it was last Thursday.
That our Coast Guard basically fired on, and President Trump said, well, they were bringing drugs into the country, and we still have yet to see about evidence regarding that, but it seems like there's definitely. My point is that it seems like obviously it depends on who is the president of the United States, right? So the foreign policy is, and that does happen, right? But it changes depending on who is president. and which presidents believe that it is how much authority they have to engage in certain acts. Yeah, please, Terry.
Are you saying that, like, to piggyback off of what you were saying, how Obama wasn't anti-war? So are you saying, like, Obama probably wouldn't have shot at them? Like, is that the route, like, is that the route?
If I'm going to be fair, Obama actually. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So Terry's question was about piggybacking off of what I'd said. Would Obama? Do I think that Obama would he have done something similar, taken like preemptive action against an enemy? I mean, President Obama did authorize a lot of drone attacks.
Yeah.
I mean, he was kind of the king of drones for a while. I mean, while he was president, and did it quietly, right? It wasn't something that was talked about very much, but it was done. Do I think though that he would have? I mean, I can't say with certainty, but if I was to, I would say that he probably would not, because he was more of the idea that you're going to take action with your allies and not act unilaterally, because it tends to, which is the same way that George H.W. Bush thought. You know, when you act with your allies, there's more cover for all of you if you're acting together. There's more of a mandate if it's not just yourself going, right? If you're going with friends. So hopefully that answers. I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah, I think the Obama calculus was that the American people were exhausted from wars in the Middle East, and using military force in Syria would be complicated, to say the least. You can be successful early on like you were in Iraq, and then have insurgencies against you because of your presence there. You can have a lack of legitimacy for whatever government exists after your use of military force, and then there's this. Back in the 2003 Iraq War, Colin Powell, who's the Secretary of State at the time, they called this like the Pottery Barn rule, but like you break it, you own it. And you go into Iraq and you destroy their government and their leadership and their military. Well, now you are the proud owners, essentially, of everything that transpires in Iraq afterwards. And when do you ever leave? There wasn't, and so he had, not to get too much in the weeds, he had basically punted and said, Congress, you need to vote on this, and Congress didn't vote on it. So I bring that up as an example, though, because I'm not exactly sure in the right timeline here, but was it about a year later, the incursion, whatever we want to call it, invasion of the little green men from Russia into Ukraine? I'm trying to get that right, if it's 2014 the first time.
Yeah.
And so this kind of idea is like, world leaders, they look around and they're like, okay, well, just like Assad can kind of do what he wants internally in Syria, maybe we can do what we want internally, and maybe we can do this across the border where there's a disputed border, and then it doesn't look like there's the ability for this exhausted superpower who has financial problems, whose domestic population no longer wants to intervene in global wars. Again, all of this is before Trump, that global leaders are going to kind of see this as kind of carte blanche, that they can kind of do what they want. And we can, not to go out of order here, but we can get closer to more recent events to see how, whether it's a Netanyahu or a Putin, and the list goes on, kind of see this as a way for them to kind of act with impunity, in that the United States does not have the same power over maybe Israel or maybe some of the other European states that it once did. But I don't want to go out of order.
I mean, your comments make me think of a couple of things, of that idea of, the U.S. as a sort of, main power actor in a post-World War II environment, that truism that if the U.S. or whoever is in a leadership position for the U.S., if the U.S. pulls out of something, if the U.S., sort of reallocates resources, that idea of, that kind of power vacuum, right, being created, and it can give other leaders potential for, all right, let's see what we can do here.
Paying attention.
And I'm thinking particularly, certainly of, both two things. One, the U.S. pulling out resources in what is now, South Korea, certainly in something like 1949, 1950, and then all of a sudden the invasion at the beginning of that massive war, which although there had been conflict before that, and it's a civil war and there's a lot of other things going on there, but then also the Ukraine giving up of its nuclear arsenal in the 90s, and the protection guarantees and all that were made and everything, and then the not living up to some of that stuff.
Right. I've got a bunch of different things I could say. I was just kind of curious, and if you don't mind me asking a question, and if I don't want to pivot from any of our topics, I've got this picture up there of USAID, which is I'm not sure if all of you here if you're familiar with what USAID does, the agency that USAID, and I don't remember what, I know it started in the post World War II era, but it was designed. The idea was as like examples of American soft power, right? You're giving medicines and food aid to places where people need it. And so what we've been hearing a lot in the news more recently with a lot of the cuts that happen, because I'm piggybacking off what you said originally, both of you said. Mm-hmm. I think it's one of the reasons why people voted for Trump in 2016, and again even now in 2024, was this idea that he was anti-war, right? That's how he positioned himself, as this person who's going to kind of, and so this feeling of, if we're giving money to these other people somewhere across the world, then we're not taking care of our people domestically. And I'm just kind of curious if any of you have any thoughts on it or have any opinions on it, because I look at this and hear about food spoiling in these places, in these warehouses, and hearing about HIV medication that could save little kids' lives. And I think if you talk about it like that with most people, they're going to say, yeah, give that kid who needs HIV medicine their medicine so they don't die. But we don't usually hear that, right? We talk about in these general terms, and then the ramifications of what happens kind of goes unnoticed. And I don't mean to get on a tangent. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of curious if any of you have any thoughts on it or have any questions about it, or if you know anything about this.
I think this kind of goes. I had a question I was going to say for the end, and it was pretty much about when we were talking about.
Can I give you this?
Terry, you mind using the microphone? Sorry.
No,
No, it's just being recorded.
Okay. So we were talking about 80 to 100 people were homeless in Europe around 1945. So I was wondering, were there any pandemics, like how we just had a pandemic? Was it something like that drew people homeless or had them losing their jobs, or was it just war? And was this just Band-Aids, so to say? Is this for homeless people, or is this for people going to war? Who was this for exactly?
I can speak about the 1945 part if you want to talk about the AID part. Is that singularly just war? Well, war can bring on a multivariance of forms of violence, right? So, for example, you end up with the homeless folks. You end up with the infrastructure that is destroyed. You end up with then a lack of access to clean water, which then means that you're going to have rises in diseases. And the only reason that I know this is because I was looking at it before we got here today. So there's a great book by someone named Tony Ute. It's called Post War. It's all about Europe right after 1945. And the figure that he cites is the idea that it's something like 66 out of every 100 babies born in Berlin in 1945 died due to disease. So you just catching them, and there being a lack of ability to treat them right at that moment. And so 66 out of 100 babies that are being born are dying that specific year. So you have poor harvests because late 1944 throughout 45, folks are fighting, they're not planting. So then that contributes to the food insecurity. And then the weather, the massive, really bad winter. So all of that creates conditions out of which you have these, compounded humanitarian crises that then arise.
I just wanted to speak to, I kind of both sides of my mouth, devil's advocate, arguments on both sides. One thing I'll start with is I think if you look at when we have budget problems in the United States, we spend more than we collect in revenue. And there's seemingly throughout history one topic that Americans are united where a majority of people say we should cut it, and it's foreign aid. And I think under Trump in particular, a lot of people have said there are people suffering in the United States and people in the world, you know, there's corruption or they don't like us anyway, and we shouldn't do that. And I don't mean to just say that that's the only argument, but on the other side, you know, this is coming from U.S. farmers. So it's helping U.S. farmers produce, you know, have incomes. And then just the liberal side of this, like people would say the post-World War II is this, the post-World War II liberal isn't just associated with the Democrats. It's this idea that we're all kind of connected. And if somebody's poor in Europe or in Africa and Asia, they could become communist or a terrorist or a threat internally and potentially to the United States. So when I say internally, that there could be civil unrest in that country instead of now being a good trading partner where we can sell them things, there's chaos in that country. And I'm not trying to like worst case this, but you get that kind of idea. And that there is maybe a little bit of human rights and responsibility of the world's biggest superpower, economically, militarily, to help those who are in need. And then there's, of course, some self-interest in this too. But also with like, it could be the next pandemic or Ebola. If we're using medication and science and assistance to help make sure that these things do not spread beyond their borders and become a problem globally, disrupting the total economy like it did with the pandemic, or kill American people, that this is money well spent too. And the number of lives, this has the AIDS medication in particular saved millions of lives. It's been miraculous in what it's done. And so anyway, I'm just going to leave it there. There's other directions I would take it, but I know Merri was waiting to speak to.
I don't remember what I was going to say now. I don't know if I remember.
Oh, the USAID, I think about.
I can't remember what I was going to say about that.
Was this connected to most pandemics? Is that why people are getting it? Or like, how are they?
This is decades old.
Yeah.
How are they getting, how do you get it?
Okay. So how do people that need it get it, basically? I don't know about like how. I know it's in, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but I know that there is so for countries or areas, let's say we're talking about like sub-Saharan Africa or somewhere where, let's say taking AIDS specifically, where there is a crisis where, because at one point in countries like Uganda and elsewhere, you had like 1 in 3 people, my statistic could be off, but it was a very high at one point. It was being done, again, for some of the reasons that Professor Navratil was saying, but also just for humanitarian reasons, to stem the flow of that spreading. And then also, like, if there is there's famine taking place right now in the Sudan, again. And so the idea of this food that is being grown by American farmers and being sent, so they're being paid by the American government and being sent over to places, again, using Sudan as an example, it helps. It helps American farmers, but it also helps feed people who are in need, right? So it has a dual purpose. And it has that name on there, right? It has the name saying, so it's an example of what you call soft power, the idea that people associate that and they think that this is coming from the American government, maybe, and having a positive association with that. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Anything you want to add?
No.
Okay. Other questions? Is that okay if I'm asking?
No, yeah, absolutely. And this is not the end of questions, but since there was a little bit of a pause, I'm going to fill that empty space. And, you know, again, going out of order, but now that we're down to maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes, this was a situation that just happened, I think, yesterday morning. Mm-hmm. Israel attacked Qatar. There was, I just want to read this from this article. So just so you know where I'm getting this from, Israel's attack on Qatari soil leads Gulf powers to question U.S. protection. So it's New York Times yesterday. And then, so this is, Israel didn't even, and let me try to set this up a little bit. According to Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, Donald Trump is like the best friend, ally that Israel's ever had. The United States historically has been the biggest ally that Israel's ever had. And Netanyahu spoke glowingly about Trump, right? But they didn't give Trump specifics, Israel, before they attacked Qatar. And in attacking Qatar, it was an attempt to assassinate senior Hamas officials who had gathered to discuss a ceasefire proposal to pause the war in Gaza, a deal that was backed by Mr. Trump. This is a direct quote from the article. Qatar being unable to protect its own citizens with literally the U.S. Central Command on its own territory has prompted locals to question the value of American partnership. And then you may also know, like, Qatar gave like a $400 million plane to Trump as like a personal gift. So like there's this close relationship, but they didn't even get this heads up from the United States with details because Israel didn't give that to them. And so I see this as one of many examples to where the United States does not have the same influence, even over some of its closest allies, that historically it once did. We could give examples even in the Obama administration. So this isn't just about Trump, where Obama would talk about no more settlements for Israel. And Netanyahu would announce a new settlement. I could get this wrong, but either when Biden or Obama was like landing the plane in Israel, and on that day they announced new settlements, like literally just violating what he says. I can't get the date right on this either, but Netanyahu comes to the United States to visit. And essentially gets into this, I can't remember the exact time, it was almost an hour. He's like lecturing Obama on Israel's security threats. And you can just see Obama sitting there like he's being lectured like a little kid by this ally, fairly weak power globally.
Whose weaponry comes from us, basically.
Right, money, billions of dollars of aid coming from the United States. There's just a lot of these examples that transcend any one presidency, that the United States doesn't seem to have its same influence that it once did. And I'm not directly saying that leads to Israel bombing 6 other countries in the last couple of years, but I think it plays a role. And that's kind of the reason for this event, to kind of show that all kinds of nuances, but this lack of kind of U.S. leadership, but also just the decline of this World War II structure and global institutions is leading to, this is like a 2,000-plus-year-old quote by Thucydides, but the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer as they must. And I think that's a presiding belief amongst many global leaders, including maybe the United States leader.
And I think it's also a reflection of what's happening even internally in the U.S., where you have a lot of people, you know, even going back to talk about Israel for just a moment, going back to the founding of the State of Israel, President Truman at the time said, well, the reason why the U.S. supported it was because he said, I've got a lot more Jewish constituents than I do Arab constituents. Well, now there's a lot more Arab constituents here who are willing and to flex political power and to say something about it. And many, because of social media and things like that, where more Americans, I think, are seeing the aftermath of some of this action, are questioning the U.S.'s role in it. Whether they're Americans who happen to be of Jewish descent or not, you're seeing that questioning of it. So a lot of these things that were status quo, that in American foreign policy you would have seen people questioning before, are now under question. And it just makes me really curious to see how things are going to, how that relationship is going to continue developing. Because now you have openly American congressmen, Democratic congressmen, who are saying, talking about the idea of weapons being withheld or aid being withheld unless specific conditions are being met, which is something that you would not have heard traditionally in the U.S. Congress.
To build on what both Kevin and Merri are saying, you know, to the earlier points about foreign aid and involvement and this idea of unrest in the U.S. and this idea that, well, if we end foreign aid, that's going to kind of be a fix for everything, you know, I think about sort of the might or lack thereof of the American economy, and the idea that it was during Andrew Jackson's administration that the last time that the federal deficit was paid off, of like Okay, you want to end that. All right, we've literally only had it all paid off once, and it was prior to the American Civil War. So I'm not sure if that necessarily, there's a great question, does that actually solve things, with that? But there's a certain element of fear, right? A certain element of concern. And it also makes me think about the journalist and historian Rick Atkinson, who he once wrote a book about Vietnam, and he said that post-World War II, America struggled with the disease of victory. And I think that also is something that could be applied in some ways in a post-Cold War, last 30 years, in thinking about, your point in the idea that it seems that, yeah, we won the Cold War, but we're kind of struggling with the disease of victory. And we've been struggling with it pretty mightily in the idea that, it's post-war military power, certainly, but it's also very much post-war economic power, that is driving so much of this. And we've had a sort of reassessment and reshifting in that, yeah, our allies aren't exactly listening to us all that much anymore. But then again, we've also had a global resurgence of other power actors that they also have to take into their calculus and consideration, be it China, be it India, et cetera. They very much have to take that stuff into consideration. The U.S. hasn't had a, 7%, 4 to 7% economic growth for a run of 30 years, since the late 60s, of that has an effect on what we can do both at home and abroad. Very, very, very much so.
That's a good segue.
It's a great segue.
Thank you.
So many things I would like to say now, but go ahead.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
So the picture that you see before you here was of a recent, how long ago was this now? Just a few months? Was it a month ago? I can't. My sense of time, I feel like right now, I don't know if all of you feel the same way, but the way that events seem to occur so quickly that I'm kind of sometimes forgetting when something even happened. But it was in the recent past, we'll say, that Xi Jinping invited Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un from North Korea to view military parade taking place. And the picture, if they say that a picture kind of speaks 1,000 words, this picture is saying quite a bit. Where to pick up on Josh's point, where the U.S. has kind of maybe not been as active, China is not making that same mistake. And China's been building. China has been. I just pulled a statistic from an article from this past week that China's exports to Africa are basically, twice what they were as American investment in the continent of Africa is plunging. So they're not waiting for us to come back. They're just taking our place and making inroads and literally building roads, and bringing in aid and doing things that the U.S. before would have done.
Yeah, there's a lot of directions to take this, and I think it's important to point out, it isn't just the decline of the United States. There's the rise of others, including China, especially China, but India, the European Union as a whole, Russia at a minimum regionally, and so it's a very different landscape. And I think I had I can't remember if it was last fall or last spring, but this is like a similar time period, perhaps, where you don't have one single superpower. You've got multiple emerging powers, and historically, like we were saying, pre-World War I, pre-World War II, these are some of the most dangerous international times when you have a multipolar system. And so having these leaders, and there was another group, the Shanghai Cooperation Group, and you had, Turkey is a part of NATO, an ally of the United States. They were one of the few countries who came in the 2003 Iraq War who assisted the United States, or at least supported them. India, who it's been decades in the making of the United States to have a better relationship, economic integration with India, and to see how quickly, like right now, India has 50%, the United States has put 50% tariffs on India, and you're essentially moving. There's a different picture we could show of Modi and Xi laughing together, yucking it up type of deal, and the argument is you're kind of pushing, and we could give better examples too, or other examples of 80 years of friendship with Europe, with Canada, and now to see how just in a pretty short amount of time those friendships are eroding, And there's a lot of ways of looking at this, but one is just in terms of, not that you would fight, but if you were to fight, you would probably want your friends on your side. If there was a group of people who you saw as an enemy, and as a group, they're going to probably be able to defeat you by yourself. But if you have your friends, it might deter the other group from ever wanting to even start a fight with you. That's not that dissimilar from what we're talking about. Having allies, I could pull up a link here in a moment. When you put Europe and the United States and Canada and Australia and Japan together, there's definitely a huge advantage economically and militarily that they have over China. But by themselves, especially if you project to the future, those advantages essentially evaporate in many different categories over China. And so if you were China, this would be an ideal situation for the United States to not only in the process of eroding power, that they're kind of breaking up with a lot of their friends, threatening to invade Greenland, making Canada the 51st state, putting punitive tariffs on all kinds of historical allies. So it's just kind of a curious situation in this moment of threats from Russia, threats from China, or at least a rising China that could be a threat to be going in this direction.
It just some of that makes me think of some of the more recent political optic decisions, in that we seem to want the optics of the World War II era, but maybe not the reality or recognition that that was a war won with friends and we didn't do it alone. That the majority of German casualties were caused by the Russians. That the, sort of that kind of thing. That we need to recognize. That was, it's sort of, it makes me think of, it was a few years ago, Tom Hanks was in a movie about the Battle of the Atlantic and the idea of American ships crossing the Atlantic and sort of that kind of thing. Generally, most of that was done by the Canadians. If you wanted to have like a sort of regular sort of whatever sort of depiction of that in terms of a Hollywood movie, Hanks would be Canadian. It would be a movie about a Canadian, sort of the Canadian Navy of like, we had help. We had a lot of help. So.
Very fair. Especially on this 80th anniversary of...
Right.
This is the link. This is the link I was talking about, that United States, this is from a couple, 4 days ago in the New York Times, that the importance of the United States needing their allies, and I just wanted to show you some of the stats here. It gets a little confusing, but with gross domestic product, the best way to really look at that is with adjusted for purchasing power, because the United States cost of living is so much higher in China, so when you control for that, already China is ahead of the United States. So only in the purple, so the blue line is the United States, the yellow orange is China, and then the United States with all those allies I mentioned earlier. So just the need to have friends in this volatile, dangerous world is important, and it's a way to kind of make sure that I guess you have the ability to confront China if you ever needed to. You'd be stronger with having all of these friends. And I don't know if this video is going to work. This is really a throwback. So another element of this is kind of like of the post-World War II structure was free trade. Once upon a time, pre-World War II, we had high tariffs, where you, kind of tit for tat, where each state you'd raise tariffs on them, they'd retaliate on you, and this would lead to higher prices for everybody. So just wanted to play. This is from Ronald Reagan. Who, if you don't know who he is, he was the president, kind of one of the key Republican figures in the last 50 plus years, president in the 1980s.
Our peaceful trading partners are not our enemies. They are our allies. We should beware of the demagogues who are ready to declare a trade war against our friends, weakening our economy, our national security, and the entire free world, all while cynically waving the American flag. The expansion of the international economy is not a foreign invasion. It is an American triumph. central to our vision of a peaceful and prosperous world of freedom. After the Second World War, America led the way to dismantle trade barriers and create a world trading system that set the stage for decades of unparalleled economic growth. Yes, back in 1776, our founding fathers believed that free trade was worth fighting for. And we can celebrate their victory, because today, trade is at the core of the alliance that secure the peace and guarantee our freedom. It is the source of our prosperity and the path to an even brighter future for America. Until next week, thanks for listening, and God bless you.
It's just a very different, I think, mindset from the current Republican standard bearer of Donald Trump, of the views of the importance of global trade, economic integration, the benefits that one would have from free trade. So just down to maybe 5 minutes. So again, open to you. Things that we haven't talked about, questions, comments.
You've been a very nice audience, very patient. Yeah, please. I'll bring the microphone if you don't mind, just because otherwise it doesn't get picked up.
I don't really know too much about tariffs. Can you just explain to me like what they are, really?
Sure. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, so tariffs are really a tax. And the idea is when something is imported into a country, that you're going to add, let's say you're buying or a $10,000 vehicle from Europe is imported to the United States, and you do a 20% tariff. So now instead of being $10,000, it's $12,000. And so you're adding a tax to that imported good, and the idea is that now that it's $12,000 instead of $10,000, if there's, and I'm using really bad numbers because we don't have vehicles that sell for this amount, but if there's a domestic vehicle like Ford that is made for $11,000, now the domestic producer has got an advantage because it's going to be cheaper than the car that's imported, but it's only cheaper because of that tariff. And so you're kind of punishing goods and services that are coming from abroad and giving a leg up to those that are created domestically.
And who pays the tax?
The consumer tends to be
The consumer economist would argue almost without exception that it's ultimately the consumer that pays the tax. Now, we have had recent examples of sometimes some companies that have kind of borne the brunt of the tariffs, at least recently, but now they're starting to raise their prices because they could only do that for so long before they start to lose their own profits and margins compared to their competitors. And so when, I had an event on this, it's a really important topic, and I'd be remiss without saying that, like, domestically, since the last 30 years plus, a lot of manufacturing jobs have vanished from the United States, some of which have left because of the high cost of labor or environmental regulations in the United States compared to other parts of the world. Some of it's through technology and automation and all kinds of changes and increase in service jobs and things that didn't even exist 30 years ago. So it's kind of a complicated thing. But I'd be remiss to not point out that, especially in areas that we live, in kind of the old school Rust Belt where we used to have a lot of manufacturing jobs, that a lot of those people have been hit hard, especially if you don't have a college degree. But the argument against tariffs is that, people are going to retaliate. So when we have tariffs, they're going to retaliate with their tariffs. It's ultimately going to hurt consumers. It's going to be significant taxes. Many people would argue, the economists have pointed out, it's estimates of like $2,800 that the average family is going to be paying in higher tariffs. Then going back to the 1930s and the pre-World War II era, that these kind of tit-for-tat retaliation with tariffs are a contributing factor that can lead states to go to war with one another when they feel like they're being taken advantage of by other countries, or there's unrest in their populations because of high inflation that tariffs can lead to as well. And I apologize for doing like a 1-minute version, but
Oh, that was good. No, so just to circle back to what Kevin's saying, that's basically when we say free trade agreements, that free trade agreements, that's what it's talking about. The elimination of making goods to be able to go from one country to another cheaper without having them to be as expensive. So without having those tariffs associated with them, that makes the cost of what you're buying more expensive. And that gets into a bunch of other questions that, I'm sure we could.
You talked about this. I think Reagan talked about it, and I think Josh meant like, a billion is okay. Over 1 billion people globally came out of poverty through free trade. I mean, if you look at China, you look at India, parts of Mexico, the list goes on and on. There's been job losses in some of the developed world. There's also been job gains in service jobs. But much of the world has gained from free trade. The economic prosperity from 1950 to 2025 has increased something like 4-fold, so really significant growth, not just because of free trade, but definitely a huge contributing factor. She's got a question.
No, there's a question.
My final question is, what is the difference between the OTAN, and the NATO? Or is it one and the same?
It's the same thing. It's just
Okay.
OTAN is NATO, like backwards. So yeah, it's it's like,
Gotcha.
yeah, it's the same. No, I'm glad you asked it. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it was started in 1949 at the end of the war, and it was like the idea of a collective security organization, almost like the idea of, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. If one of the countries that are part of that treaty were to be attacked, the other countries that are a part of it would come to their defense. And because of it, there's, what Kevin was referring to, that the idea of safety in numbers. The charter of the organization was never had to be enforced until September 11th, because we were the country that was attacked on 9/11, and so then in response, other countries came to our aid and helped us in the aftermath. So no, I'm glad you asked the question.
It's worth building on what Merri said, that part of the foundation of it as well is coming out of the Marshall Plan, and coming out of that idea of the U.S. is saying at that time of, hey, we have all this aid that we can give to folks, and then you have some nations that they're not sure if they can take it because of what's going on with the Soviet Union and their expansion and everything else. And part of it was a way of saying, look, we can all band together, and the U.S. will support you, and it'll be okay. The economic insecurity of that time and the privation of that time is just, whew, it's really hard to contemplate.
Yeah, well, we appreciate your attendance and great questions, and thank you to the panel members, and
Thank you for organizing.
appreciate everyone being here. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you,
thanks to the
everybody.
library for having us.
Thank you.